If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review House of Tremere, a sourcebook for Vampire the Dark Ages. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. I have said on more than one occasion just how much I love the World of Darkness community. It is perhaps the only community I feel truly a part of, which is where I've made most of my closest friends and interact with a whole host of beautiful people who get me, which is weird, because I barely get myself. It's not perfect, however. Nothing is, as perfection is purely a subjective state of being we will never truly achieve. One thing that really grinds my gears is the memes that only serve to present Vampire the Masquerade as a bad joke. Now, before I get to the angry V5 stans rushing into the YouTube comments or furiously button mash a passive-aggressive tweet aimed at the continuously alienated older fanbase, answer me this. What is the first thing that springs to your mind when you hear the word salubri? It is probably one of two things. They have 3 eyes, and they are a yummy snack. I have rambled on in great depth in my V5 companion guide review how I loathe this meme, and how certain individuals within the community just seem to deny such a meme exists, only to then complain that everyone makes fun of the salubri for being the thing they, the content creators, perpetuate. Of course, humour in the horror genre is often needed, for everything can't be doom and gloom all the time. This, however, is childishly annoying. And why is it that the salubri are treated as an edible meme? Well, it is because of the clan's founder. Salot was devoured by a vampire wizard called Tremere. See, even the Tremere cannot escape such petty humour. But it's not just the humour, but the attitude towards the Tremere that frustrates me greatly. More often than not, do I see folks treating them like D&D vampire wizards or nerdy bookworms who just so happen to dick about with magic. A common stereotype it may be, but it really does not do the Tremere as a clan justice, to which I tell people who ask me for help to do a couple of things. First, I tell them to listen to my podcast episodes on the Tremere, Gargoyles, and Blood Brothers. If that hasn't convinced them how fucked up the Tremere are, I tell them to read House of Tremere, which I believe sets the tone for the rest of the episode. But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules to the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics, and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong, and vice versa. Finally, I am also going to give you a content warning, for some of the book's themes are a bit gruesome. Whilst I usually give these warnings in the descriptions, you will soon see why this edition is needed also. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. Unlike most of the books I've reviewed, this one is a soft cover rather than a hard copy, so I can't copy and paste the same part of my previous scripts this time. House of Tremere is a gorgeously frightening book to look at. Being a source book for the first incarnation of the Vampire Dark Ages line, it uses that marvellous black and white marble design and original Dark Ages font for the title and subtitles. Those of you whose only Vampire Dark Ages experience is through V20 Dark Ages, you'll recognise the font instantly. If this is the gorgeous part, then the frightening part is the rest of the art on the front cover, which involves 3 sinister-looking Tremere, 2 in red ceremonial robes and 1 in black, all 3 hooded, witnessing the birth of a gargoyle as it crawls from a large cauldron. It's not terribly clear at first, which may be down to the scanning of the images onto my drive-thru-RPG copy. It is actually something that is fairly persistent throughout the book. This leads me onto the art itself, and the best way I can describe it to you is that it is all variedly, consistently inconsistent in style and quality. House of Tremere is a source book that details Sirius, the head Chantry of the Tremere during the Dark Ages, and it is filled with detailed map designs, various character profiles, and other torturous displays of Tremere fuckery. The art styles for the cast, mortals, vampires, and gargoyles alike can be broken down into 2 styles. The first and perhaps the most prominent style is what I'd call simple yet detailed black and white rough sketches that definitely have the most vampiric flavour to them. I'd say these have the highest quality when it comes to how they have been scanned in. The other style has a far more cartoony look, a style that I love and hate. Hate because the quality of the scans are not very good and are very much on the blurry side, but I'm putting that down as a drive-through RPG thing, so take that with a pinch of salt. They also seem very out of place with the general VTM vibe, especially within the Dark Ages setting. This, however, contains some of the most twisted and disturbing art found in any World of Darkness book I own to date. This is the love part. There really should be a content warning beyond the standardized "this book contains mature content" section at the front of the book. A particularly potent example of this is whatever the fuck is going on page 112. Two naked women are sewn together whilst making out, while sewn to another guy who is having his stomach stretched open with some sort of vice whilst having his eyeball pulled out, and he is the only one that doesn't seem to be having a good time. Many of the previously mentioned rough sketches are also very visceral, but it is not as clear as these larger caricature drawings. I'll also add that whoever did these more cartoonish characters definitely has a thing for larger women. Now, this is by no means a bad thing, but a mere observation. When you open the book, you are greeted with an introductory chapter that details a brief and engagingly concise overview of the Tremere's inception and the politics of Serios. It is the HQ for the Tremere, and they have pissed off the Tzimisce, who they share their domain with in Transylvania, by using them as the source of their vampiric power, both as a bloodline and to create gargoyles. You are told that there are two major factions in the Chantry, the Conservatives and Conspirators, headed by Etrius and Goratrix respectively, and some independent immortals that reside in the Chantry, both magi, slave, servant, prisoner and resident. Whilst it should be assumed that players and mainly storytellers would know a good amount about the Tremere before purchasing this book, it does provide a new light on them to make the reader view them ever so slightly differently than other sources, and here on the Lore by Night podcast, we like different takes, provided it makes sense. Chapter 1 provides us with the fullest description of the formation of the Tremere that will ever exist, as described by one of its founders, a mage now tree Wraithini by the name of Ponticolus, who became the very base in which Serios was formed. I mean this quite literally, as he is killed as part of the ritual and has Goratrix dismembered member shoved into his mouth. Magically, Goratrix does grow back his penis. There is a lot to this chapter, and it is all beautifully and sadly written, but that little section and the fact that Goratrix has two penises has just stuck with me for no real reason at all. It is an interesting read, learning more about the clan's creation from one of its founders, and one that is openly honest, filled with uncertainties and worries, words I would never find myself using when describing the Tremere. The chapter concludes with a box containing the fate of Serios, which is a nice little detail for storytellers that may wish to include that in their sessions as the end of a particular Dark Ages chronicle or as fodder for another more modern chronicle. The book does this a lot actually, mainly with its cast, which makes a nice change to these sorts of source books to know how they lived on. Or didn't, in the case of a lot of them. The next 3 chapters are all about Serios, the surrounding land, and the going-ons within. My first comment is the order of the chapters is a little weird to me. I would order them 2, 4, then 3. Chapter 2 is about the surrounding land and the kinds of traps one may encounter. It is a very short chapter, filled with booby traps, both supernatural and slightly more mundane, that provides plenty of imaginative ways to cause harm to the players. It also includes an illustrated map for STs to use in their sessions. Chapter 3 is a much larger chapter that details what is happening within the Chantry itself, written in character, this time by one of Etrius' servants, Coratherium, the Castilian of Serios, who is composing a letter to Etrius. It sets up later chapters nicely, providing a horrible insight into their total callous natures and the little regard to humanity and anything remotely ethical. However, I believe this chapter should have gone after the 4th one, which provides a very thorough layout of Serios and the surrounding area. I would be prepared to argue that it can be a little too thorough, as you feel the size and scale of this castle, which feels more like a fortress at times. Common rooms, torture chambers, and even Tremere's chamber itself are explored in so much detail, leaving very little room for interpretation, as there are plentiful maps included as well. This chapter would be an excellent aid to those struggling to create their own chantries. With Sirius explored in great and beautiful detail, we turn our attention to Chapter 5, which is where the various residents are explored in fuller detail for the first time. Each character here has a large write-up with many tips on roleplay, goals and motives, including rivalries for other Tremere and the Chantry, as no one really seems to like anyone, which is exactly how it should be. The Tremere care for one thing only, and that is their own personal growth as a mage. They want very little in unlife, and that just turns out to be a lot of power. Most of the characters have stats for STs to employ, which I always appreciate, for newer storytellers may struggle with creating stats for their own NPCs, let alone established characters. Certain notable characters do not, such as Vastania and Etrius, characters that are established mages that know far too much for anyone's good. Most interestingly, you have non-Tremere vampires who reside in the walls of Sirius, such as Down to the Copt, a Setite who allegedly helped the Tremere find Salot, if only by accident, as he was actually trying to lead them to Set, which is confusingly interesting. Players are most likely to read the following chapter, Chapter 6, before anything else, for this is where the new thaumaturgy rituals can be found, most of which are truly disgusting. That image I described to you earlier on, the one on page 112, yep, that is one of the rituals, which you can look at in your own leisure, you sick fucks. The writers also present the tools for players, but most likely STs, to create your own thaumaturgical paths, which differed immensely from V5 and older legacy editions of the game. I find the sections about learning the different levels, specifically of the time it takes to learn and practice them, especially useful, as it is often just swatted away in games where they take far too much time to roleplay. It also emphasizes the point that these magics are serious things and should not be treated with such nonchalance. There are also rituals to place onto your gargoyles, which are called humours in this book, but goes by a different name in future Dark Ages supplements. The rituals I mean, not the gargoyles. If the gargoyles in your games weren't terrifying enough, coat their hands in a substance that poisons anyone who touches them, or make it so that their blood pool refills itself. On the topic of gargoyles, a new road titled the Road of Service is created for them, which you can probably work out what it entails. It also provides an interesting new skill called Gargoyle Ken, which is all about the handling and commanding of gargoyles. It is an interesting idea, as I have always assumed the gargoyles were sentient beings, but as the book explains, not all of them were. Some of these gargoyles are more weird and monstrous, such as the Hexapod. Lore enthusiasts would know that Vastania didn't just create gargoyles, but a whole slew of horrible hybrid creatures such as the Ichor and Chittera, all of which inspiring fear and gross panic. Interestingly, like the characters in the previous chapter, these all have a little paragraph about how they faded out of fashion. The chapter ends with what I believe is a very weak section on creating mortal mages, as it provides very little information on providing concrete systems to use, relying on the reader to purchase a variety of Dark Ages books from the mage and vampire lines. At least it provides stats for STs to use for creating mages of different ages and experiences. The last chapter provides a selection of chantries across Europe at this time, giving inspiration to the ST wanting to use the Tremere in places like Paris or the British Isles, which I'm glad is getting some inclusion here. Like Sirius before, great detail is provided on the small handful of chantries, not as much on Sirius, so there is more wriggle room with interpretation. The one chantry that caught my eye the most is the one in Proprietus, and is run entirely by fledglings. I shan't go into it too much, but I will say that this may be the most useful for V5 players and storytellers to take influence from. I believe this is actually a very useful book overall for storytellers, who I believe will benefit the most from this book, as it is very clear that was the intended audience. There is very little crunch for players to sink their fangs into, but there is enough for them to develop their own characters, both as a Tremere or the masochistic bastard that wants to play a Dark Ages gargoyle, slave to their warlock masters. House of Tremere is a horrifying book that misses no punches when it comes to the sheer brutality of the clan. It pulls back the curtain and puts a massive spotlight on just a few selections of their barbaric practices and truly abhorrent selfishness, as we are presented what the founders were up to way back when. Whether you are a player who wants to find a way to make your Tremere that bit more interesting and less vampire wizard, or an ST wanting to make them heinous villains, or just need some inspiration in how to lay out your chantry and authoritative figures, I highly recommend this book. Whilst very wordy and terribly in-depth throughout, this is worth every penny. Just remember not to read this round your family. And for those of you who are new to the Law by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Specimen Chamber out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.